Oh, hey, CNFers, the show takes a lot of time, and part of what keeps the lights on here is if you consider hiring me to edit your work. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. It could be something as simple as a pitch, proposal, an essay, hell, even a book. If you need help cracking the code, you can email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com and we'll start a dialogue. There's also patreon.com/CNFpod. For a few bucks a month, you support the show and be part of a cool community of nonfiction writers. Depending on your tier, you get some nice face-to-face time with me to talk things out, because sometimes you just need to talk it out, man.
What I do is, once I've gathered a bunch of information and once I've had the piece kind of simmering in my head for a while, I get out a legal pad and I do what I call the blurt.
Oh, hey, CNFers, excuse my voice. I lost it a few days ago, like completely lost it. Because I saw Metallica in Foxborough. I lost my mind, and my best friend from high school, who is not a Metallica fan, saw me in an altered state of consciousness, and I'm not so sure he likes me anymore. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Wow. I've got Tomlinson here today, journalist and the author of Dogland, Passion, Glory, and Lots of Slobber. At the Westminster Dog Show, it's published by Avid Reader Press. In my little free library outside my house, underneath the big pine tree, I saw a woman holding the copy I have of Dogland that I had put in the library. I startled her coming around the corner, and I said, "Oh, that's a great book." And she was like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yep." And she took it with her. And I was like, yes, now I get to put more books into it. And it is a great book, where Tommy's creativity and zest for dogs and dog culture come through in this book. And at its core, it's really about connection. And that was the one-word summation Tommy conjured as he was writing this book. And that was kind of a true north compass for it, so to speak. Capital A, about. Tommy is the host of the Southbound podcast, the author of Elephant in a Room, a memoir about being overweight in America, and has written for Esquire, ESPN The Magazine, and Garden and Gun, among many others. He has a great Substack called The Writing Shed, and he was once a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize as a columnist for the Charlotte Observer. Show notes and the parting shot to this episode are at brendanomera.com, where you can also sign up for the companion Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. I'm not really on social media these days, so the newspaper is my means of promotion, if you will. Book recs, cool links. Goes up to 11, man. Good times. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Tommy was a great hang. Been long wanting to speak with him, and this was really just such a rich conversation about writing and reporting and dogs. And also a parting shot about Metallica and turning my book in. Wow. Let's hit it. Riff.
Many of us introverted people to have to go out and then hawk these things in front of people. Though it doesn't feel quite like hawking, but it kind of is. Hawk adjacent.
It's definitely hawking, and yeah, I mean, I think I've learned, having been a journalist a long time, I think I'm naturally introverted, but sort of professionally extroverted, where I can talk and get a conversation going and meet people and that sort of thing. But it is sort of draining. At the end of the day, I'm pretty wiped out, and it's not like I'm digging ditches or anything,
right.
But I'm meeting a lot of people, doing a lot of stuff that's not necessarily my nature to do. And so, at the end of the day, it's I need to sleep in a little bit the next morning.
I'm totally the same way. When I have more than a couple interviews in a day, it's like I have no battery left at all. It's
right.
I totally need to plug me into the wall, because even making phone calls, especially cold calls for me is just always, it's just not in my nature to want to do it. And I am always filled with a sense of dread about it. And it almost never goes as bad when I get the person on the phone than it is in my head. But no matter what, it is anxiety inducing to have to pick up the phone. It just always will be.
Well, I wish I should. Yeah, I was gonna say I wish I could tell you that goes away, but
Yeah.
I've been doing this a long time, and I still get the cold sweats on that too.
Yeah, yeah. There's even a line in Elephant in the Room too, where you're like, you would goad yourself with like a reward of some kind. If you're making that difficult call, it's like, okay, then I can go and treat myself with something. But it's that nature of like, yeah, sometimes we do have to like psych ourselves up somehow just to do something that is on its surface as simple as just dialing a few numbers.
Yeah, I mean, you just never know what you're going to get on the other end, and my wife and I talk about this all the time. It's the lack of information that drives us crazy. So until you make that call, you can only imagine what it's going to be like, and your imagination tends to go to like the worst possible outcome.
Yeah.
And so and like you said, it's almost never as bad as you imagine it might be, but until you do it, you can't know that. And so your brain kind of fills that vacuum.
For sure. And I also love this notion, and I love talking about this, especially with sports writers, is when we think of the great athletes that we have revered over the years, and so often they are, of course, physically gifted, but a lot of that physical giftedness is tethered to film study, and they're always studying, be it defenses, their own technique. And I love extrapolating that to writers and how, yeah, we can write in our journals and write columns and articles all we want, but at some point or another, you do really have to do the film study. And I wonder for you, like when you lock into a piece of writing, be it your own or someone else you really admire, what's the nature of your film study when you're looking to get under the hood?
Well, I start by just casting as wide a net as possible. And so, for example, in this dog book, I just, set up a bunch of Google alerts about dogs and Westminster Dog Show and that sort of thing. I tried to figure out where information might be incoming, like academic papers, things like that. I, went through Amazon and just searched for dog books and, clicked on a bunch that I found and thought that might be useful. And then I just started like gorging on this stuff, as swallowing as much as I could. And what I found out in this case is that the amount of information out there on not just dog shows, but dogs in general was really overwhelming for me. And it took a long time for me to not be really intimidated by the idea that I was never going to know enough. I was never going to be the kind of expert who would be able to like remember everything about this or speak with absolute authority on these subjects. I had to sort of figure out what I wanted the story to be then, and then sort of narrow my focus to the parts of the research that would be helpful for that. But that took like probably a year or so before I did that. And I've got, a big bookcase over here with a bunch of dog books on it and magazines and all that stuff. I have files and files, and Pocket online with like thousands of magazine articles and academic papers and all that sort of thing. It was just a fire hose of information that I had to like kind of deal with for a while before I could figure out how to cull that a little bit and make it more manageable.
Yeah. At what point in the process and the formulation of, let's say, your point of view in this story, did it finally kind of click into place?
I had thought about what I wanted the book to be about for a while, and I had kind of various ideas about, about happiness and what I like to be able to do whenever possible is to kind of narrow the whole piece down to one word. Like, what's this story really about? And in a book length, it's never going to be just about one thing, but what's sort of the North Star that I'm aiming toward as I write. And in this, it took probably a year or so at least to do this, but I finally settled on the idea of connection. Dogs and people have built this bond, this connection over 30,000 years. What does that mean? And what does each side get out of it? Then more narrowly, in the dog show world, people have, figured out, dog handlers and people like that have figured out how to make this connection with show dogs in a way that is entertaining and enlightening and makes for good TV and all that kind of stuff. How does that work? And what do both sides get out of that? And so that whole idea of the connection, in the show world, at least, the handler and the dog are literally leashed together. They're connected in a physical way, as well as sort of a psychological and emotional way. And so I thought exploring connection in its different forms was sort of what I wanted the big picture of the book to be about. We always talk about text and subtext. What's the book about? It's about, following a show dog through the Westminster Dog Show and exploring the history of dogs and people. That's sort of the plot. But what is it really about? It's about connection and why that's meaningful. Why do we need it? And how dogs and people provide it for each other.
In what ways did this exploration of connection make you evaluate the connections in your own life?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think toward the end of the book, I come up with sort of a limited theory of happiness. It's not anything that's going to shock the scientific world. Nobody's going to be writing academic papers about it. But I had to think about, the original question I started this book with is, are show dogs happy? And I kind of came to some conclusions on that, and came to some conclusions on how dogs become happy and what they get out of the human relationship and how dogs make us happy. And I've certainly applied some of those ideas to my human relationships, because sometimes I think I know with the people close to me, sometimes the people I share a household with, a lot of the conversations we have tend to be sort of transactional. Like, when are you doing this so that I know when I can do that? Mm. And, who's got to take the garbage out? Who's washing the dishes tonight? Who's cooking? All that, the sort of stuff that is required to make a household go, but is not really getting at anything meaningful on a deeper level. And so, dogs can figure out how to get to our deeper emotions. And I realized that sometimes in my just normal conversations with the people I care about, I was doing more of the transactional stuff and less of the kind of emotional stuff. And so it led me to, I hope, start to form deeper relationships with the people I care about.
You note in the book too how let's say when a dog dies and we're forced with that or tasked with that awful day, that awful decision of having to let them go, that oftentimes we feel a deeper sense of sorrow for this wonderful critter that we've been able to spend, I don't know, let's say 10 years with, versus say even a loved one, be it a parent or a sibling. Like that, the pain is almost more intense for the dog than it is for a person.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that in general, our relationships with dogs are less complicated. Dogs never come home late at night. Dogs don't argue with you over politics at Thanksgiving, mm-hmm. All those things. And so the relationship generally it's not quite as gray. It's more black and white. Also, I think dogs sort of invert the natural order of things in the sense that they're sort of, children in a sense, and we don't expect our children to die before we do. Although if you take on a pet, at least subconsciously, you know immediately that that's probably going to happen, but you can sort of like push that thought off into the future until it actually comes about. And then I also think that often with pets, it tends to happen more suddenly and with less a forethought. Often let's say our parents or people we care about have a long illness that might be diagnosed early. You have a lot of time to sort of prepare for it and think about it, say what you need to say to your loved ones, that sort of thing. With dogs, it's often a diagnosis where they say, your dog, let's say, has cancer or whatever, and we can't really do anything about it. And probably the best thing would be to go ahead and put him to sleep now. And always, that decision is sudden in a way that it's often not sudden with the humans in your life. And so that terror, that fear, that sorrow hit you in a way, it's like one big wave as opposed to a lot of little ones. And so it really slammed you. And so even if you love the human being more, which is almost always the case, that pet's death can hit harder.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I know with the two dogs that we had let's see, Jackie, we had to put him to sleep in 2017 and Smarty in 2018. It was it's like the day is coming and they're fine, and then suddenly both of them, they were just kind of like good, and then all of a sudden like off a cliff. And it was just like a wrecking ball came through, and then we had to really gird ourselves and try everything we could, and then eventually, you are left with just like, this is the day I have to call the vet and carry him in there and, have that awful moment, of mercy, I guess. But at the end, it's still, it just rips your heart out.
Sure. And I think the other part of it is it's your decision for that. You're deciding to do that for and to that creature.
Yeah.
In many cases, not all cases, you have some control over, if you're sick and you tell the doctor, stop giving me medicine or whatever. For many people, the method of their passing is somewhat under their control. But when you have a dog, you're making the decisions for it. And they're innocent too. They didn't do anything to you. They didn't bring this on themselves in any way. It's not like, they're lifelong smokers or something like that, where they might share some blame for what's happening to them. They're innocent in a way that no human really is. And so all those things play into that sledgehammer feeling when you have to let them go.
Yeah. Yeah, when you were, when one of the interludes, when you talk about Fred, I was just like, this is gonna be, this is gonna be great, but like, I know where this ends, and I'm like, God damn it, Tommy, and 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 of course it goes there, and it was, it was definitely a point. I was reading it, I had my dogs around me, and it's just like, as I'm reading that, I'm just like sobbing as I'm reading this. I'm like, shit, this happens.
Well,
God damn it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to do in this book is take people through all the emotions, right? When you have a dog, when you love a dog, there are all these moments of incredible joy. There's these like hilarious things that they do. There's these moments when you feel like they kind of see into your soul. There's the moments when they're kind of reading your mind somehow and you're reading theirs. All these great moments that you have with them. And then there's the end. And that's very sad and painful and sorrowful, but that's part of it too. And so I wanted in the book to not leave any of those on the table. I wanted to walk you through all of it. And so that's kind of part of why that was in there.
And as you're really starting to coalesce this focus of connection, and then particularly the relationship, or let's say like Stryker is kind of a through line throughout the book, and the dog circuit was just this incredible, highly decorated. Was it Samoyed? Is that how you pronounce?
It's Samoyed is the way normal people like me and you say it. In the dog show world, they call it Samoyed.
Okay.
Because that's closer to like the original Russian pronunciation.
Excellent.
They're particular about that sort of thing.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Well, exactly. When you take an anthropological deep dive into a subculture of this nature, it's like you gotta like get those details right, because I'm sure there's some dog person out there who's like, you got this little detail wrong. You're like, well, I'm a journalist, and I try to get it right, but my God,
I gotta tell you, that's the thing I had the most anxiety with about this book, was that because I came in as a total novice and exited as pretty much a novice too. Like, even having written the book about it, I don't know nearly as much as your typical dog show handler or breeder or somebody like that. And I was really worried about getting, important stuff wrong. So I had two people who are involved in the dog show world pretty deeply, and one of them who's also a vet. I had them kind of be early readers on the book, and they pointed out, in the drafts, a lot of stuff I had not gotten right or had not understood the nuance of, especially. And so that was really helpful to me as I was going through it, to feel like somebody who really knew what they were talking about had read it and sort of vetted it.
Yeah, it's for years I covered a lot of horse racing and wrote a lot of columns, and even had just some other longer stuff too. And it's a sport that has its own language, and around this time, the Triple Crown season of Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont, and if it creeps into the main culture just for a couple days, you hear people on the radio, like hosts and stuff, like this last horse that won the Preakness, and there's a big partnership involved, and someone's like, "This is amazing!" Like, people bought into this horse. Like, this should be like a thing that more people can buy into horses. I'm like, well, that's been going on for decades, but it's one of those things where if you don't know those nuances of a really intricate subculture, if you overstep yourself in a sense, you quickly reveal your ignorance with respect to that particular subculture.
Absolutely. And yeah, every subculture has its own language, its own rules, its own etiquette, its own lore. All those things are important to know. And I wanted, it was a balance for me as I got into it and started to learn more. I didn't want to pretend I knew stuff I didn't. So I didn't want to like come in talking the talk too much, because then people would assume that I knew stuff that I didn't know yet. And so I tried to be, in talking to people, even once I started to know a little stuff, I wanted to talk about it in as much layman's terms as possible, so that as people told me stuff, they didn't skip over something that they thought I already knew, but I wasn't clear on.
Yeah, well, it gives a sense of, a narrative revelation. So, like, as you're learning, so are we by extension. And so, yeah, it allows us to go through, biology 100 before we get to, organic chemistry way on the other end of the spectrum.
Right. And this is my favorite kind of reporting. I think about it a lot of times like I'm a translator. My job is to go into this world that people might be curious about, but really don't know a whole lot about. Go in and sort of learn it, like going into the jungle or something. And I emerge and I'm able to tell the story in a way that a larger audience can understand, but also is truthful and accurate to the way that the people, in that subculture also understand it. And so I really like doing that kind of reporting. It's always been my favorite kind of work.
Yeah, and baked into that is always, when you're talking to experts, there are certain things that they take for granted because they're steeped in it. And, and you come into it as a novice. You don't know the difference between, this, that, and the other. And so you have to have a certain measure of courage to just be like, you know what, talk to me like I'm a 12-year-old. I really don't know what's going on here. And sometimes in our own insecurities, we don't want to sound like an idiot. But I think the foundation of being kind of a good reporter is like, I'm kind of an idiot here. Like, just help me be less idiotic. And you are my guide to do that.
Yeah, it's that whole thing about there's no such thing as a dumb question,
Yeah.
My friend Joe Posnanski, the sports writer who I've known for like 35 years, when he told me a story one time about when he was a young reporter covering baseball. I think he was covering the Cincinnati Reds maybe, and somebody had shown up for like an old timers day. And in my mind, it was like Ferguson Jenkins, but that may not be right. Anyway, Joe went over to him and asked a question that he really didn't know the answer to, which was basically like, what's the difference between a curveball and a slider? And when he asked that, a lot of the old hands in the locker room, a lot of the media guys kind of snickered at that, right? But the pitcher, whoever that was, started showing him the difference, started talking about the difference in the grip and how the arm moves and all that sort of thing. And Joe noticed as he was explaining it, all the old guys were sort of nudging in closer because they didn't really know either. But they pretended to know because they thought it was important that they be seen as sort of having expertise in this field. And so I learned a lot from that story and just from doing it myself that, if you go into it and you say something like, pretend like I don't know anything about this. Just tell me like you would tell a little kid. Some people will sort of snicker at you and sneer at you and talk down to you in that moment. But many people will not. And they're excited about somebody new wanting to learn about this thing that they know a lot about. And those are the people that end up being the sources for my stories. This is why I ended up with Laura King, who's the Stryker's dog handler and the person you kind of followed through this book. One of the reasons she's that person in the book is that she didn't talk down to me, and she understood what I was trying to do and helped explain it and really talk to me through how this world works in a way that a lot of other people either didn't want to or couldn't. There is all this language and lore and stuff that you have to kind of figure out when you're in this new world. And then I think the job is to, not overuse it when you're translating, or if you use it, to try to figure out where you have to explain it. So there's a lot of like stuff in this book that I feel like I had to explain, from kind of the basics of like how a dog show works. There's a little, section in the front of the book that just lays that out at the very basic level, to how dogs accumulate points to become champions, to, all that, to how the judging works with conformation and breed standards and all that stuff. And I always try to make that as brief and entertaining as possible, but it's stuff you have to know to make the rest of the following stuff make sense. And so, I always kind of enjoy that task of figuring out how to like condense this stuff and explain it in a way that it doesn't feel like, homework. And it doesn't feel like something you have to, a bitter pill you have to swallow before you get to the good stuff.
Yeah, this will be on the test.
This will be on the test, right? And so that kind of stuff, and a lot of that is figuring out what of it I can actually leave out, and there's a ton of stuff that I know now that's not in the book, because ultimately I decided that the reader didn't need to know that stuff. And so that, the more savvy and the better you are at learning this stuff over time, the easier it is to figure out what to leave in and what to leave out.
Yeah, that's always such a hard decision. This at least the galley I have right through the epilogue, it's 224 pages. Odds are you probably had enough material to write twice this, but eventually, you do have a way, and through experience, you're like, okay, that's a cool detail, but it doesn't ultimately serve this narrative. So when you're having those conversations with yourself or a trusted reader, it's just, how do you ultimately make that judgment of like, oh, I like this, but ultimately it's got to go on the floor?
The main rule is, does this fit the story I'm trying to tell? And does it tell me does it tell the reader something new along the way? So for example, late in the book, I have a chapter where I have a couple of short interviews with kind of well-known people who had dogs, have dogs. Scott Van Pelt from ESPN is in there. This woman, Tressie McMillan Cottom, who's an amazing sociologist at University of North Carolina, she's in there, and they both have dogs. Scott lost a dog. They tell stories about how it's changed their lives. Well, I talked to a third person too. I talked to this guy, Josh Dawsey, who's used to cover the Trump White House for the Washington Post, now covers national politics, that sort of thing. He had a dog that he adopted and came into his life and kind of changed his life too. And it's a really good story. It's a lovely story. I wrote it, intending to put it in the book. But as I went through, I kind of realized that it was redundant in a way with the other stuff that I already had in there. And so even though I liked Josh a lot, loved the way he talked about his dog, I ended up cutting that section, which is like, I don't know, 750 words or something like that. I cut that from the book. Now, here's something that's kind of new in this world we live in. I'm probably going to give that section to readers of my newsletter in the next week or two as like bonus material. So there is a way to sort of deal with some of that stuff now that there didn't used to be it was harder to do in the past. So I do feel like that could be still useful down the road. But then there were a lot of other smaller things, like a paragraph or two somewhere or a sentence or two even. I mean, I've got a file of cuts that probably runs 20 or 30,000 words in itself. That's just stuff I cut for one reason or another. Either I didn't like the way I wrote it, or it, matched something else somewhere else, or I just decided not to go down that particular rabbit hole. And so the reason I like kind of aiming toward one word or one thought in a book is because that makes that decision to leave something in or out a little easier. Because, okay, is this about connection? And does it tell the reader something new about connection that they didn't know before they read it? If it doesn't meet those two requirements, then it should not be in there.
Do you keep a Post-it note or something of that nature as a North Star or a compass so you are on that true line?
I had that word connection on a Post-it note, but it was easy enough to remember. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to remember like a quote or something that I'm working from. So that was, on my desk literally, but also on my mind the whole time. And sometimes, you forget. And I would write for a day, and I would look up at the end, and I'd written, 1,000 or 1,500 words or whatever. And it didn't fit because I had wandered off down a side path that might have been good writing, might have been interesting information, but it didn't really fit what I was trying to do. And so that went in the trash bin.
You saying good writing and even recognizing that in yourself, which in and of itself for many writers might be hard to admit or even give ourselves credit for when something really has some snap, crackle, and pop to it. So when you're in the throes of something and it's kind of feeling good and you read something you're like, wow, I really like that. What is it about you and your style that you're like, oh, I like the sound of that. This sounds like me and true to my voice.
The bigger picture for like my whole career, what I think of when I try to write is I want to write about big ideas in very simple language. That comes from my background. My mom and dad were not very educated people. They were cotton pickers, sharecroppers down in South Georgia. They both had to quit school and elementary school. But they were voracious readers, very intelligent people, but they didn't have like the facility of language that, a college graduate would have. And so, but they were also understood and lived big emotional lives. Like they went through the same big emotional beats that any human being does. And so they understood the emotional stuff. They just didn't have like Shakespeare's language to express it in. And so I wanted to reach people like that with my writing. And so I always think if I can write about big, important issues, emotional beats, and do it in a way that anybody who picks up the book or the magazine piece can understand it, that's when I'm at my best. And so when I write a passage that hits the mark there, and I feel like anybody could pick it up and read it, but it still hits hard in some way to any of those people, that's when I feel like I'm doing really well. When I tend to not do well is when I get a little too enamored of my own vocabulary, and I start to write stuff that's a little too complex, or too many big words, or, trying to show off a little bit. I think the more I show off, the less effective I am as a writer.
Right. Yeah, and I totally agree. And it's sometimes we grow up with the writers that we admire, be it novelists or short story writers or great columnists or great feature writers. There are those flourishes that and those pyrotechnics that really make us lean in to those pages, and we're like, I kind of want to do that too. But when you do at times elevate, you just elevate too much, try too hard, it just comes across flat, stale, and just like you say, it doesn't feel like it's you, and you're trying too hard, and that's ultimately what you kind of don't want to do. You want it to feel easy for the reader.
I can put on a tuxedo. I've worn a tuxedo a few times in my life. It is ill-fitting on me. And I kind of feel the same way about my writing. I can write a pretty fancy paragraph if you made me do it at gunpoint. I could write something that feels literary, in that sense. And sometimes I do, not thinking about it. And I go back and look at it and go, that's not very good. It's that Elmore Leonard rule, right? If it feels like writing, take it out. Mm-hmm. I do feel in a sense that that's the case for me, not for everybody, obviously, but for me, that if it feels too fancy, if it feels too much like I'm trying too hard, that it's probably not landing on the reader very well, because it's like a movie where there's so many special effects that you start thinking about the special effects rather than like what's going on in the movie.
Yeah. You
tend to lose track of like who the good guys and bad guys are and why it matters, because so much cool stuff is blowing up. And that's, I don't want that in my, I want people to come away with having really felt something meaningful from the story I write. And whether they remember some particular sentence I wrote no longer matters to me at all.
If afforded the time, do you find that a writing issue is often the result of a reporting issue at its root?
Almost always. John Franklin, who was one of the guys I sort of looked at as a mentor. I didn't know him, but at his work, he had a book called Writing for Story that I remember I devoured when I was first starting out on all of this. There was a quote that the writing coach at my first newspaper used to pass around from John that said, "Meaning comes from reporting. The answer to most of the existential questions in journalism is pick up the phone." And that is, I found to be true in my work, certainly when I was a daily columnist and didn't have time. A lot of times I would go back and look at my stuff, and the fanciest writing I did was when I knew I had to write around something. I didn't have the information that I needed, and I didn't have time to get it. So I made like a really pretty paragraph, hopefully to distract you from the fact that I didn't really have the goods. And I think that's still true for me. I will, look back at stuff I've kind of overwritten in a way, and it's because I don't know something that I need to know. And I either try to go find it out, or if I can't find it out, I skip it or, get around it the best I can. But I don't try to like patch over it with fancy writing as much anymore.
Yeah, in the process, be it reporting or writing, which one appeals most to you and makes you feel the most alive or engaged?
I think there's a point in the reporting for me. There's several stages at which my natural anxiety about the project lessens a little bit. And the big one for me is when I feel like I've done enough reporting that if I had to go write the book tomorrow, I could, and that sometimes for me is a matter of weeks. Sometimes it's a matter of months. This book, it was probably at least a year, maybe a year and a half into the reporting, where I felt like I got to the point where, if the world stopped tomorrow and my editor called me and said, you have to write this book in 2 weeks. You don't have, there's no more time for reporting. Just go do it. I felt like I could produce something worthwhile. And that's always a huge load off my shoulders, because at the beginning, I'm just trying to learn, figure stuff out, make connections between things, put a shape to it all those sorts of things. And that often, takes a long time to come together for me. And sometimes it doesn't really come together until I actually get pretty deep into the writing. And that's really like sweat inducing for me when I'm writing. I've written a lot and I still don't really know what I'm talking about. And often that does mean going back and doing some more reporting and making more sense of it. But I think the reporting part is more satisfying to me in that sense, because it's the thing that eases my anxiety the most when I know I've got the goods, so to speak. The writing part, the pleasures are there, but they're a little smaller. They're like, oh, that passage is pretty nice. Or, oh, I feel like, for me, the big part of the writing is when I get to the really emotional points, the beats that I really want to land on pretty hard, I want to make sure I tell those really well in a way that kind of extracts the emotion from it that I want the reader to get out of it. And that's important too, and it's meaningful to me, but it's not quite the same level of relief I have when I get enough reporting done.
Do you find that you have to, or you've had to learn how to get comfortable with writing before you were quote unquote ready? That way you're revealing potholes in the road as you're laying down road. You're like, oh, okay, this is a place where I might have to go back for some reporting and so forth.
Yeah, and I think I learned that just writing for the newspaper, because you're always on a tight deadline, and you're always having to like, you don't have time to like wait and do all your reporting and then write. I was doing, for a while there for the Observer, I was doing like 4 columns a week. And so I'd have to go out and make a couple of calls. I would come back and start writing and have calls out, or, need to look up something and then go back and, add stuff or change what I'd already written because I had new information. And so it was constantly, it was never just like a shift from one to the other. It was always sort of both at once. And that's always been the case. Even as I started longer pieces, I will, if I think of something to write, I go ahead and write it, whether it's going to be right at the beginning of the book or something that may end up in, 8 chapters down or whatever. I go ahead and write it and just stash it somewhere and then come back to it. And when I come back to it, it may be that I don't need it anymore, or it may be that it fits better somewhere else, but I've already started it. And that's sort of in my subconscious as I go through the piece. I know that's out there for me to try to maybe connect other things to as well. And so it's always all kind of mixed together for me. And I can't, I can't afford to wait till I'm done with the reporting, because the reporting, I mean, for me, goes up almost to the very end.
Yeah.
I mean, I was still looking stuff up, 2 days before I had to turn the manuscript in. And so, and there's a scene in the book that I had to go back after I thought the main reporting of the book was finished, and I had to go back and like drive up to Michigan and spend a couple of days up there for a scene that probably lasted 10 or 15 minutes. But I had, once I realized it was happening, I knew I had to have it in the book, and I was well on the way to like what I thought of as being done by then. And that sort of rearranged a lot of things in the book. And so if I'd waited, I would have been really screwed, because I wouldn't have, all the other stuff I wouldn't have written yet.
Are you much of an outliner or a planner when it comes to, writing long pieces and especially book-length stuff?
I am absolutely terrible at it. It's my worst. It's my worst. The worst part of doing this for me, the part I've always found the hardest, and the part that I have never acquired good habits at. So here, I'll tell you what I do, with the caveat that nobody else should do this. What I do is, once I've gathered a bunch of information, and once I've had the piece kind of simmering in my head for a while, I get out a legal pad and I do what I call the blurt, which is I just start writing down everything that's in my head. And it could be like 2 words, like Stryker's coat. Or it could be a quote that I remember. It doesn't have to be accurate at this moment, or a little scene or something like that. And I just write and write and write on this legal pad until I've like exhausted my brain, until I can't think of anything else that is in my head about this piece that I'm doing. And at a book length thing, I might fill up a whole legal pad, or maybe a legal pad and a half, hundreds and hundreds of little items. And so then I go back and I read through those items, and I start seeing ones that sort of fit together. Like, this is about judging dog shows, for example. Oh, and this little bit has to do with judging dog shows, and this little bit. And so I get out a fresh legal pad, and I start to rewrite this whole thing, but grouping things together. And so, if I'm lucky, when I get to the end, I might have 8 or 10 or 12 sort of large groups that these things kind of fit in. And those basically become the chapters of the book. And then I'll subdivide those groups into smaller groups, and those become the sections of the chapters and that sort of thing. And I'll always go back and like relook at stuff I've saved, or reread passages in books and that sort of thing, because I don't count on my brain to remember everything, but I do count on my brain to remember sort of the major parts of the story, and then I supplement that with kind of researching stuff. And I found for me that this works as a way to sort of organize stuff in my head, and then on paper, in a way that sort of tends to break down into a structure. Now, that's worked for me so far. I like I said, I don't recommend it as a way to work for other people. It may just fit how my brain works well, but that's kind of the way I do it.
Yeah, and the thing about keeping things in your head in a way is that it's kind of self-pruning. You're like, if it's right, good enough to stick in my head, then that's probably what should be in the book. And versus throwing everything in there, then trying to prune out. You're like, if I'm remembering it, it's that means more than throwing it all in and then trying to cut it out.
That's probably true. Although I have to say, as I've gotten older, I have to pay attention to how well my memory is actually working.
Yeah.
And because I know there will come a point at which, my brain won't function as well as it has, and I won't be able to count on that. And I'll probably, at some point, maybe as soon as whatever the next big thing is, I'll probably have to come up with a better method to deal with this. And I have friends who have like very super detailed, methods of organizing and structuring their work. And one thing I hope to do before I tackle whatever the next big thing is to learn some tips and tricks from them so that I don't get myself in this pickle next time.
Yeah, you should talk to our mutual friend and acquaintance, Kim Cross. She is quite
Kim,
good at that.
she was the first person I thought of. She's unbelievable.
Yeah. And she ends up, in the acknowledgments, she, along with, Bronwyn and among others, were some trusted readers of yours. And at what point do you feel confident sharing a work in progress to get notes?
Well, for me, it's like when I have not the very first draft done, but a draft with some polish on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it kind of, as I send it out to the editor, who wants to see like an early version, I'll also send it to these early readers. And, I think it's very important to choose those people carefully, because you want people who are fans of yours, who want your work to succeed, but you don't want people who are just going to tell you that everything's great. I have very good writer friends who I don't trust to be readers because they won't tell me what's wrong. They're great cheerleaders. They're just not great editors in that sense. So I remember for my first book, I sent it out to several people, and one of them was my friend Rosita Boland, who's a great writer in Ireland. And she sent back the manuscript and marked it up. She had marked it up on paper. And there would be one paragraph that she would like, brilliant. And then the next paragraph she'd mark through and it would say, rubbish, and that's the kind of person you want. You want somebody to tell you when something's brilliant and when it's rubbish. And so for this book, I chose 2 or 3 people like Kim and Joe Posnanski and folks like that who I thought would tell me those things. I chose Bronwyn for those reasons, and also because she had written a book about dogs, Pitbull, which was an amazing book. And then the other people I chose, as I said before, people who were familiar with the dog world and would know whether I was talking out of my hat when I was talking about this stuff. And so it was a really good group, and I got a wide range of comments that were immensely helpful.
Something that I love, just kind of a nerdy reporter type question. I'm a notebook pencil junkie, and I love, if I could crack open writers' backpacks when they're on reporting trips, I'd be like, I just want to rip it all out and throw it on the floor and see what's in there. So for you, what are some like indispensable favorite tools of yours that make you feel, ready to go on a reporting trip or whatever?
I'm pretty simple, but the stuff I really like. So these reporters' notebooks made by a company called Portage, I think. They're the ones that are often standard in newspaper newsrooms everywhere I've worked. They've used the same brand, and you can buy them through the company or through Amazon or whatever. They're the sort of ones that fold over the top vertically. They fit well in my back pocket. I use them all the time. I don't buy any other kind. That's the only kind I've ever bought. I think it's weird how you learn why stuff works for you and why it doesn't. Those Portage ones, when you like turn the page, it doesn't get hung on the little wire spiral.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've bought so many notebooks where they get hung up and I have to like kind of by hand, like pull the paper through and they tear off. The Portage ones don't work that way. They're beautiful. For end of the day, or like a notebook that I just carry around with me every day, even if I'm not on a reporting trip, I carry around a moleskin, like a pocket notebook. I'm kind of picky about those too. I like the soft cover ones because I put them in my pocket, and I like the lined ones. And so I always, I buy them like a dozen at a time, and it's what I use as my day-to-day, just carrying around, making list notebook, but I also use the same notebook to keep a journal every day. So at the end of the day, when I'm on a reporting trip, I'll sort of summarize what I did in that notebook. I find that when I do it analog, longhand, I remember it a lot better than if I do it in a computer somewhere. Pens, it used to be just like whatever pen was at the hotel I was staying at. I've gotten a little more, I don't really have a go-to day-to-day pen, but I will tell you, now that I have a couple of books out, I tried out a bunch of pens to sign books with, and I found a pen I really like. It's called the Pentel Sign Pen. It's sort of a slim, kind of fine point felt tip pen. I found that Sharpies tend to bleed through the page too much.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is like a nice felt tip, gives a really good line, and it helps me, on the times when I get lucky and I have to sign a lot of books, it doesn't wear out my hand, and it always looks good. And so I have that stuff. I tape stuff through my phone. I have an app called, I think it's called Tape Up. Wait a second. Let me make sure I got this right. It's called the HT Recorder. That's the app I use to tape calls on my phone. It organizes them into files pretty easily, and I can transfer them to my laptop pretty easily with that. It seems to work for me better than like just the voice memo thing. There are different settings on it for different kinds of rooms, that sort of thing. And one thing I do is, I guess I'm still a little old school on this. I actually pay to have stuff transcribed by humans.
Mm-hmm.
I don't use Otter or any of those sort of transcription services because I tend to find it takes me just as much time to correct those as it does to have somebody do it right the first time. And so I've learned that my time is valuable enough that if I pay somebody to do it, it actually saves me money and time in the long run. So there's a service, I think the guy's out in Colorado somewhere. When I do stuff, I, send it off to be transcribed, and it's, a tax write-off, and I found it to be more efficient than doing it the other way.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, you're saying a lot of recommending a lot of really cool tools about what you use, and as I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking a guest for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners out there, and that could just be anything you're excited about. So I just extend that to you, Tommy. What would you recommend for the listeners out there?
There's two, I guess, works of art that have come out this year that I really have dove into and have meant a lot to me, and I've sort of stay in my head long after I've parted with them. One is a record, Casey Musgraves. It's called A Deeper Well. I'm not sure what it sounds like to me is sort of a song cycle of exiting one relationship and entering another. It gives kind of a Fleetwood Mac vibe to me, but not quite as complex. It does what I try to do in my writing, which is tell pretty powerful story in pretty simple language. And I find that I keep coming back to those songs, and they keep revealing themselves to me in new layers. A book that I've just hit me like a sledgehammer is by a Canadian author named Amy Lynn, and it's called Hereafter. It's 2 words. It's a memoir. So Amy's husband was running like a foot race, like a half marathon or something, one day and died suddenly out of nowhere. And Amy's left as a young widow, and I think around 30 or thereabouts. And this book is a series of short sort of postcards from the abyss of grief. It's like 150 short chapters. Most of them are like half a page. Some of them are maybe, the longest ones might be 2 or 3 pages. Just what it's like to have this whole life you saw in front of you suddenly get snatched away, and to not be able to get over it. And she writes with such amazing power and tenderness and feeling. And I'm sitting here looking at the book now. It's on my desk, and wanting to pick it up again and read about it again, even though the subject is so hard. She tackles it with a fearlessness that I really admire. And that book has stayed with me more than anything else I've read this year.
Oh, amazing. Well, Tommy, this was wonderful to get to talk some shop with you and to unpack Dogland a bit, which was just such a fun deep dive into that subculture, and we're just riveting and heartbreaking and happy, and really gets to the core of what you were after with a connection. So I just want to thanks for coming on the show to talk shop, and thank you so much for the work.
Oh man, this was such a pleasure. They're great questions, and I love to talk about this stuff.
Oh man, thanks to Tommy. Yes. And you see it for listening and being my why for making this podcast. If you dig it, subscribe, recommend it. The show is only, let's just say this, the show's been going for close to 12 years. And it's only grown, and it's only as popular as it is. Because there's no media company behind this. I'm totally independent. It's only popular if it has indeed any degree of popularity, because it is passed hand to hand. People are like, oh, here's this really cool show, and the host is insufferable at times, but my gosh, he has really great guests on his show, and that says something. Anyway, as I type up this parting shot, it is the day I've submitted a very late stage draft of the Prefontaine book, which we have, I think, settled on a title. Here you go, breaking news. The Front Runner, Steve Prefontaine and the Dawn of the Modern Athlete. A befitting title for this dude. We're right around 108,000 words, which, if you've been following the arc of this conversation, it means I've cut more than 52,000 words from the rough draft, or the zero draft, depending on what you want to call it. I cut a short book out of my book. I'm liking the arc of it. I like how each part feels distinct, and that it builds and it builds and it builds. My wife read a late-stage draft of this, with particular attention to transitions and stuff of that nature, confusion, And she's a battle axe when it comes to editing. She rarely has anything nice to say about anything I write or do. And when she was about to finish reading it, she was sad because she forgot for a moment that Prefontaine was going to die. And he had really come to life. And when she finished, she said, Brendan, you have something potentially great here. And she doesn't just toss around words like that, which is kind of weird to hear coming out of her mouth, but it was pretty nice for her to even say that. And of course, it's going to need some work, more work. It always does, some extra polish. But through the absolute brilliance of my editor, the book has a really nice shape to it. I won the lottery with him. I really did. Some people I've confided in can't believe the attention to detail, the editorial letter, the counsel I've received from my editor over the last year and a half. Sometimes I see a fiery anger in their eyes, almost like, how the fuck did you win the lottery? Beats me, but this whole process has been a string of winning lottery tickets. Kim Cross, good pal of the show, thought I should have an agent at one point. She put me in touch with Susan, who would eventually take me on. And I happened to be saving string on a Prefontaine project because we were a few years out of the 50th anniversary. And she's like, oh, I could sell it on proposal. Worked on that for a year. Sold it with about 14-month runway to an editor who's a running junkie. But he also happens to be one of the most astute and brilliant minds in the country when it comes to developmentally editing books and just having the eye for it and eye for the shape of it. And then here's little old B.O. pecking at his keyboard, things like me write good. And then everyone's like, good God, can we still get David Marinus to write this? Metallica. They played two of my favorite songs. I only saw the Friday night set. The song, one I had never heard before live, and one I've heard a million times live, but it never gets old. And so the Orion instrumental song, amazing. I took a little video, and during the video, I was like, oh, as I deleted it. And Master of Puppets, and I was like, yes, Master. Basically blew out my vocal cords, as you can tell, and I hurt my neck from headbanging so much. Seriously, my neck was fucked for 3 days after the show. And I've only now started to get my voice back, if you can even call it that. Do I sound cool? Does it sound nice? Does it Does it make you feel things? Great time being back east with people I haven't seen in years. So naturally, go back east, got to go to Dunkin' Donuts. Dunkin' now, but nah, it's always Dunkin' Donuts to me. I go in, wait for my coffee. Guy comes in, gets his coffee, and he goes like, thanks, Roger. Got to go outside now and show these guys a video of me getting tasered. This guy was like 48 years old. Next, I go over to the Packy. That's what we call it, package stores, the Packy. Buy some beer and a box out of tear in it. Guy at the register waiting for his girlfriend was like, whoa, you got a hole in the box. I'm like, shit. And then he said, I'd hate for you to lose a beer. I'm like, yes, this is home. That accent is home, right out of Central Casting. So with that said, stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview.